All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The trauma floor at St. Gabriel never truly slept. It only slowed enough to breathe between emergencies. At 12:46 a.m., the fluorescent lights hummed with the dull fatigue of a long winter night. Rain tapped steadily against the high windows near the ambulance bay. Coffee cups sat half empty at the nurses' station, their heat long gone. Claire Mercer stepped through the staff entrance with the quiet habit of someone who preferred not to be noticed. Her badge was still new enough that the plastic edges had not worn smooth. The word trauma rotation sat under her name in small print. It meant temporary. It meant junior. It also meant no one expected much from her. She placed her bag in the locker room and walked out to the floor already scanning. Oxygen ports. Monitor cables. Crash cart seals. She didn't stop to announce what she was checking. She simply adjusted things that had drifted slightly out of place during the previous shift. A suction canister that had not been replaced. A defibrillator lead clipped into the wrong slot. A medication drawer where the labels had slid just enough to slow someone down later. None of it dramatic. All of it quiet. At the nurses' station, two residents leaned over a chart arguing softly. Who prepped the airway kit for Bay 3? One asked. Not me. Claire reached past them, opened the drawer, and rotated the laryngoscope handle 90 degrees so the blade would seat properly. She closed the drawer. Neither resident noticed. Across the room, the double doors to the trauma hallway opened sharply. Dr. Rowan Kessler stepped through with the kind of presence that forced people to stand a little straighter without knowing why. He was already wearing surgical scrubs under his coat, sleeves rolled high. His hair was damp from the rain outside. His expression looked permanently carved into irritation. Brilliant surgeon. Everyone knew that. Also the man most likely to reduce a resident to silence in front of a full operating team. Why is the trauma board not updated? He demanded as he approached the desk. A nurse hurried to adjust it. Because we're still stabilizing the transfer in Bay 2, she said carefully. That answer didn't include an apology, Kessler replied. The hallway went quiet for half a second. Claire kept moving. She passed Bay 4 and paused just long enough to notice the monitor waveform drifting slightly out of calibration. The pulse looked weak, but the patient's color told a different story. She adjusted the lead placement. The waveform corrected immediately. The attending physician inside the bay glanced up. Good catch, he said automatically. Claire nodded once and stepped away before anyone asked her name. At the nurses' station, one of the senior trauma nurses watched her for a moment. She's thorough, the nurse muttered. The resident beside her shrugged. Or slow. Claire heard the word. She didn't respond. Her hands trembled slightly as she replaced a blood pressure cuff in the supply rack. The movement was small but visible. Residents noticed that kind of thing. One of them leaned toward another and whispered just loud enough to carry. See that? She double-checks everything like she's scared to touch anything. Claire continued aligning the cuffs. Her hand steadied once she stopped feeling their eyes. Across the room, Kessler finished reviewing a chart and dropped it back onto the desk with a sharp motion. Mercer, he said suddenly. Claire looked up. Yes, doctor. You're on support tonight. Equipment staging, transport coordination, and documentation. No clinical calls. The assignment landed exactly where she expected it. Support work. Observation. Stay out of the way. Yes, doctor, she said quietly. Kessler turned away before the words finished leaving her mouth. Claire moved toward the trauma cart again. Another small detail caught her attention, 2 units of O-negative blood sitting outside the cooler longer than they should have been. She placed them back into controlled storage without announcing it. The nurse who had left them there never realized. Small corrections. Invisible ones. The rain outside intensified, tapping harder against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faintly across the city. The ER settled into its late-night rhythm again. Monitors beeping softly. Residents dictating notes. Orderlies pushing stretchers down the hall. Claire finished organizing the crash cart and closed the final drawer. For a moment, everything was calm. Then the radio at the charge desk crackled. St. Gabriel Trauma, this is Medic 12. Incoming priority trauma. 2 minutes out. The charge nurse straightened instantly. What are we getting? A pause. Then the words that changed the entire room. Single patient. Severe internal bleed suspected. Mechanism unclear. Kessler's head lifted across the floor. Prep Trauma 1, he said sharply. The residents moved immediately. The nurses followed. The quiet rhythm of the ER vanished. Claire stepped toward the crash cart again and checked the blood cooler latch one more time. No one told her to. No one noticed she did. But something in the air had already shifted. And the hospital was about to remember how quickly quiet could turn into chaos. The ambulance doors slammed open before the trauma team finished pulling on their gloves. Cold air rushed into the bay with the stretcher. The patient was already pale. Not the grey of slow decline. The sharper white of blood leaving the body faster than anyone could replace it. Male, mid-30s, the paramedic called out while running beside the gurney. Penetrating trauma lower thorax. Rapid pressure drop during transport. The monitors were attached before the stretcher stopped moving. Blood pressure, 68 systolic. Heart rate, 140. The numbers blinked against the screen like warnings no one wanted to read. Where did it happen? Kessler asked as he stepped into position at the head of the bed. Private security convoy, the paramedic replied. Location sealed. We were told to bring him here immediately. The phrase location sealed moved through the room like a quiet ripple. This was not a normal trauma. The charge nurse leaned closer to the paramedic. Identity. The paramedic shook his head. Classified transport. That's all they told us. 2 men in dark coats stood just outside the bay doors, not interfering but not leaving either. Hospital security had already appeared behind them. The air changed. Political. Sensitive. The kind of case administrators remembered for years. Kessler didn't acknowledge any of that. He stepped forward with the controlled aggression that had made his reputation. Massive transfusion protocol, he said sharply. 2 units O-negative now. The team moved instantly. Clamps opened. For lines flushed. Blood bags hum. Kessler worked fast, hands confident and precise. The residents followed every movement like students watching a master demonstration. But beneath the noise, Claire watched something else. The patient's breathing. Short, controlled gasps. The wound sat just below the rib line, left side. Blood soaked through the dressing placed by the paramedics. Internal bleeding was obvious. But the pattern felt wrong. She stepped closer to the foot of the bed and watched the monitor again. Blood pressure dropping. But the chest movement was uneven. Not the way abdominal bleeding usually looked. Her eyes flicked toward the paramedic's report sheet still clipped to the stretcher. Penetrating trauma, lower thorax. Lower thorax. Left side. But the patient's right shoulder muscle tightened slightly with each breath. Claire didn't speak. Not yet. Kessler was already moving through the standard sequence. Prep for OR, he said. We are not stabilizing this here. The anesthesiologist nodded. Pressure won't hold. The room accelerated. More nurses entered. Suction units hummed. The blood warmer clicked on with a sharp mechanical sound. Claire stepped toward the equipment rack. No one had asked her to. She reached for a second suction line. Then a vascular clamp tray normally stored for abdominal exploration. Her hands moved automatically. Patterns she had seen before surfaced without asking permission. Not from textbooks. From somewhere else. From nights that had smelled like dust and fuel instead of antiseptic. She stopped that thought before it finished forming. Behind her, one of the residents noticed the tray she was placing beside the table. He raised an eyebrow. Planning to run the surgery yourself? He muttered. Claire looked up briefly. No. The resident snorted. You're staging OR tools for an ER bleed. Relax. She didn't respond. Instead, she aligned the suction tubing so it wouldn't cross the surgeon's workspace later. Another small adjustment. Another quiet preparation. Across the bed, Kessler opened the wound dressing for the first time. Blood welled upward immediately. The suction hissed louder. Kessler studied the wound for 2 seconds. Then he made the decision everyone expected. OR now. The anesthesiologist nodded. Pressure's falling again. The charge nurse moved toward the transport board. Clear operating room 3. The room exploded into motion again. Line secured. Portable monitor attached. Claire stepped back automatically as the gurney began moving toward the elevators. She expected to remain behind. That was her role. Support. Observation. But halfway to the doors, the circulating nurse glanced around the team. We're short 1 sterile assist, she said. The resident shook his head. Everyone's tied up downstairs. The nurse's eyes landed on Claire. Now. Mercer. Claire stopped. Yes. Scrub back up? The resident laughed softly. You're pulling the rookie into a live trauma surgery. We need hands, the nurse replied sharply. The gurney rolled forward again. Claire walked with them. The elevator doors opened with a metallic chime. Inside, the patient's blood pressure dipped again. 62. The monitor alarm screamed once. No one spoke. The elevator began rising toward the operating floor. Claire watched the numbers. Watched the breathing pattern. Watched the angle of the wound. The mismatch in her mind grew sharper. Something about the injury still didn't fit the story everyone else had accepted. The elevator doors opened onto the surgical corridor. Bright lights. Sterile air. Operating room 3 stood ready. As the team rushed the patient through the doors, Claire followed behind them. Still silent. Still watching. Because the mistake she thought she saw would only become visible under the surgical lights. And when it did, someone in that room would have to decide whether the rookie nurse was wrong, or whether the chief surgeon was. Operating room 3 was colder than the ER. Not just in temperature. In tone. The fluorescent lights overhead burned white and absolute, leaving no shadows and no privacy. Stainless steel trays reflected the brightness in sharp angles. The smell of antiseptic was stronger here, cleaner, almost aggressive. The patient was transferred from the transport gurney to the surgical table in one continuous movement. On my count, the circulating nurse said. The team lifted. 1, 2, 3. The body settled onto the table. Lines were reattached. The ventilator tube connected with a soft mechanical click. Monitors resumed their rhythm. Blood pressure, 64. Still falling. Claire stepped through the sterile barrier after scrubbing in. The surgical gown felt stiff against her shoulders. She moved to the back corner of the operating field where the backup nurse usually stood. Lowest position in the room. Exactly where she expected to be. Kessler entered seconds later, pulling sterile gloves into place with a sharp snap. His focus went straight to the wound. Then briefly to Claire. "You're Mercer," he said. "Yes, doctor." "You're here to assist the scrub nurse if she asks." "Nothing else." Claire nodded. "Yes, doctor." The instruction was not rude. It was absolute. The anesthesiologist adjusted the ventilator settings at the head of the table. "Pressure unstable," he said. Kessler didn't look up. "We'll control the bleed." The first incision widened the original wound with fast, confident strokes. Suction filled the air with a constant, hollow hiss. Dark blood pooled quickly in the cavity. "Retractor," Kessler said. The scrub nurse passed it instantly. Claire watched everything. Not just the wound. The monitors. Heart rate. Oxygen saturation. The rhythm of the ventilator. The way blood spread across the suction field. The operating room had its own ritual. Everyone moved and practiced choreography. No one questioned the surgeon once the procedure began. Uncertainty was not welcome here. Kessler worked quickly, exposing the deeper structures beneath the rib margin. "Liver edge," one of the residents said quietly. "Correct," Kessler replied. His tone carried the calm confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The assumption settled over the room like gravity. Liver laceration. Major bleed. Control it. Repair it. Close. Claire studied the field. Her eyes moved between the wound and the monitors. Blood loss was heavy, but the pattern was uneven. Too much pooling in one direction. Not enough expansion near the liver itself. Her gaze shifted to the patient's breathing again. Ventilator pushing air. Right side expansion lagging slightly. Subtle, but consistent. She watched Kessler place a clamp near the exposed tissue. If the bleed were where he believed it was, the pressure drop should have slowed already. It hadn't. Blood pressure, 62. The anesthesiologist frowned. Still falling. Kessler didn't hesitate. More blood. Another bag was hung. Claire studied the wound cavity again. The suction tube moved aside for a moment. Just long enough for her to see the angle of the bleed. Not from the liver. Too deep. Too posterior. Her stomach tightened slightly. The operation was moving in the wrong direction. Kessler continued dissecting carefully toward the assumed injury site. The residents leaned closer. The scrub nurse passed instruments without hesitation. No one else seemed to see the discrepancy yet. Claire's hands rested lightly on the edge of the instrument table. They trembled slightly. Not from uncertainty. From being watched. From the awareness that if she spoke now, every eye in the room would turn toward her. The rookie nurse interrupting surgery. Correcting the chief surgeon. The humiliation would be immediate. And permanent. Her mind ran the geometry of the wound again. Entry angle. Blood flow pattern. Ventilator movement. One vessel deeper than the surgical field. One vessel that would not reveal itself until the surgeon moved slightly further. But by then, blood pressure 60. The monitor alarm chirped softly. The anesthesiologist adjusted the transfusion line. "Doctor, we're losing time." Kessler's jaw tightened. "I see it." He shifted the clamp again. Still searching where the injury was supposed to be. Claire's eyes closed briefly for a fraction of a second. "Speak now." "Or wait." One wrong interruption could destroy her credibility before the words even finished leaving her mouth. And if she was wrong, the entire room would freeze around that mistake. But if she stayed silent, the surgeon might make one cut in the wrong direction. Her breathing slowed. She watched the wound again. Watched the suction clear the field. There. For just a moment. A darker pulse of blood from deeper tissue. Not liver. Not surface. Something below. Confirmation. Almost. Not enough yet. Kessler reached for a longer instrument, preparing to move deeper into the cavity. Claire's hands tightened slightly against the metal tray. Her mind counted the seconds. One more pass of suction. One more angle change. One more chance to be certain. Because once she spoke, there would be no taking it back. So she stayed silent. For one more minute. Watching. Waiting. Until the proof became undeniable. The suction cleared the field again. For a moment the wound cavity opened into clean visibility beneath the surgical lights. Kessler leaned slightly deeper over the table, his gloved hand steady, the long instrument angled toward the dark red structures beneath the rib margin. "Retract," he said. The scrub nurse pulled the tissue back. Blood welled immediately into the opening. Kessler's voice remained calm but faster now. Liver laceration posterior surface. Clamp. A curved clamp was placed into his hand. Claire's eyes fixed on the tip of the instrument. The path he was about to take felt wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. The blood pattern she had watched for the past 2 minutes pulsed from deeper than the structure he was reaching toward. If he clamped there, he would be controlling the wrong source. And worse, he might cut into the one vessel that had not yet fully opened. Her pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Her mind aligned the angles again. Entry wound. Blood flow. Ventilator movement. One structure deeper and slightly medial. She saw the moment Kessler committed to the motion. The clamp began descending toward the assumed bleed. Claire stepped forward exactly one pace. Not hurried. Not dramatic. Just enough that her voice would carry without raising it. "Sir." The word slipped into the room like a dropped instrument. Kessler did not stop immediately. Claire continued, tone calm, precise. "That's the wrong vessel." The room froze. The suction continued hissing. The ventilator clicked. But every human movement stopped. Residents looked up. The scrub nurse's hand hovered in the air with the next instrument. Even the circulating nurse near the wall turned. The audacity landed before the meaning did. A rookie ER nurse correcting the chief surgeon mid-procedure. Kessler's hands paused for exactly half a second. Then he slowly lifted his eyes above the surgical mask. They landed on Claire. Cold. Controlled. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Claire didn't raise her voice. "The bleed source is deeper," she said. "Posterior and medial. That structure won't stop it." The silence in the room thickened. One of the residents shifted uncomfortably. The anesthesiologist glanced up from the monitor. Kessler straightened slightly. His tone sharpened. "You are here to observe." Claire nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Then observe." He returned his focus to the wound. The clamp descended again. The message to the room was unmistakable. Authority had spoken. Claire stepped back immediately. No argument. No insistence. Her hands folded lightly near the instrument tray again. The moment closed. But the tension stayed in the air like static. Kessler made the clamp placement exactly where he intended. Clamp secure, he said. The suction cleared the field again. For 2 seconds, nothing changed. Then the monitor spoke. Blood pressure dropped. 58. The anesthesiologist leaned forward. Pressure falling. Kessler frowned. More blood. Another bag was connected. But the bleeding in the surgical field did not slow. It widened. The suction tube filled faster now. Dark red rising from the deeper cavity Claire had indicated. Her stomach tightened. Exactly where she feared. Exactly the pattern she had recognized. The resident nearest the table shifted his weight. That clamp didn't. Kessler cut him off. I can see that. The suction cleared again. And for the first time the deeper source became visible. A pulsing line of blood beneath the structure Kessler had chosen. The wrong vessel. The clamp he had placed sat uselessly beside it. No one spoke. Claire did not move. Her eye stayed on the monitors. The anesthesiologist's voice came quieter now. Doctor, we're at 52. Another drop. The room's earlier certainty had dissolved. The suction nurse looked between the surgeon and the wound. The resident who had mocked Claire earlier kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Across the table, the anesthesiologist glanced briefly toward Claire. Just once. A small look. Not acknowledgement. Not approval. Just recognition of what had happened. He returned his focus to the monitor immediately. Pressure falling, he repeated. Kessler adjusted his grip on the instrument. His jaw tightened behind the mask. The operation was no longer following the path he had declared. And everyone in the room knew why. But no one said it. Not yet. Claire remained exactly where she had stepped back. Silent again. Because the worst thing she could do now was prove she had been right by speaking again. The clamp still sat where Dr. Rowan Kessler had placed it. And the bleeding had not slowed. The suction tube moved again, pulling dark blood away from the field, revealing the deeper cavity beneath the rib margin. Every few seconds the anesthesiologist's monitor chirped softly as the pressure dropped another point. 49, the anesthesiologist said. No one reacted outwardly, but the number hung in the room like a countdown. Claire watched the wound with complete stillness. Her mind stopped thinking in hospital steps. It shifted into pattern logic. Entry wound. Angle of penetration. Where blood gathered first. Where it did not. The surgeon's assumption still framed the operation. Liver trauma. A damaged surface vessel. Control it and the bleeding would stop. But the pattern in front of her refused to match that story. The blood came from deeper. Posterior. Almost hidden behind the organ everyone was focusing on. Claire ran the geometry again inside her head. Not textbook anatomy. Field logic. In the field you didn't have scans. You didn't have clean lighting. You didn't have time to debate anatomy diagrams. You read movement. Where the blood traveled. Where the body tried to compensate. For a moment, the memory surfaced. Another patient years earlier. Another wound below the rib line. Another room where the air smelled like dust and fuel instead of antiseptic. Someone beside her had said quietly, "Look deeper." It's behind it. Claire let the memory fade again before it could become a distraction. This room had its own reality. And the same pattern. The suction cleared the field again. The deeper vessel pulsed once in the open space before disappearing under fresh blood. There. Confirmation. Claire didn't step forward again. She had already learned what that cost. Instead, she began moving equipment. Small adjustments. Invisible ones. She rotated the suction line slightly so it could reach deeper without crossing the surgeon's hands. Then she slid the vascular clamp tray closer to the surgical field. Not directly toward Kessler. Toward the scrub nurse. Her movements were so controlled they almost looked like ordinary preparation. Across the table, Kessler's voice sharpened. Suction. I can't see. The nurse adjusted immediately. The deeper field cleared faster now. Blood still surged from behind the structure Kessler had been exploring. Pressure 46, the anesthesiologist said. The number landed harder this time. Kessler leaned further into the cavity, searching along the same plane. Control slipping. Confidence turning into force. Claire studied the wound again. The vessel would fully reveal itself in seconds. If someone was ready. She spoke again. Not louder. Not urgent. Just calm. Sir. Kessler's shoulders stiffened. What? 2 centimeters deeper. Posterior to the clamp. The words were identical to before. Precise. Nothing added. Nothing emotional. Silence returned to the room again. But this time it felt different. Not disbelief. Recognition. The scrub nurse's eyes flicked toward the deeper field Claire had indicated. Then toward the tray Claire had moved earlier. Without announcing it, she picked up the vascular clamp Claire had placed within reach. She held it ready. The residents noticed. No one spoke. Kessler continued working for another moment, but the blood itself had already started arguing against his assumption. The suction cleared the cavity again. The deeper vessel revealed itself fully now. Dark. Pulsing. Exactly where Claire had pointed. The scrub nurse extended the clamp. Doctor. Kessler paused. Just long enough for everyone in the room to see what he saw. The bleed. Not liver. Not surface. Deeper. Behind it. His hand moved. Not toward the original site. Toward the new one. He took the clamp. The motion was small. But the entire room felt the shift. Claire didn't react. Her hands rested quietly against the instrument table again. They trembled slightly from the attention in the room, but her eyes remained steady on the surgical field. Across from her, the anesthesiologist watched the monitor. 44, he said. But now his tone carried something else. Expectation. The clamp moved deeper. Toward the vessel Claire had traced in her mind. The operating room had divided without anyone announcing it. On one side stood hierarchy, the authority that had always run the room. On the other stood evidence. Blood patterns. Monitor numbers. Geometry under surgical light. No one declared which side had won. But every person in the room knew the balance had changed. Because the rookie nurse at the back of the table had not raised her voice. She had simply moved the truth closer to where the surgeon's hands could reach it. And now the room was beginning to follow it. The clamp closed around the deeper vessel. For a moment, the bleeding slowed. Not stopped, but slowed enough that the suction nurse could finally clear the field. Everyone in the room leaned closer to the table. Waiting. Watching the monitors. The anesthesiologist stared at the screen. Pressure 43, he said. Then it dropped again. 39. The suction hiss grew louder. The deeper cavity filled again with blood, darker and faster now. The vessel Claire had indicated had not been the only problem. The patient's body was collapsing under the weight of blood loss and time. Doctor, the anesthesiologist said, voice tightening slightly, we're crashing. The monitor alarm chirped once. Kessler did not step back. If anything, he leaned further into the wound. More suction, he said sharply. The scrub nurse obeyed immediately. But the bleeding was no longer isolated. The cavity widened as blood pooled deeper behind the organs. Claire watched the pattern change. The first vessel had been only part of the problem. The deeper bleed had created pressure behind the diaphragm. The body was losing control of its own circulation. Field logic again. The kind of collapse that didn't wait for perfect repair. It required a different approach. Claire spoke quietly. "Sir." Kessler didn't look up. "Not now." She continued anyway, her voice calm and precise. "We need damage control." The phrase landed differently in the room. The residents looked up. The scrub nurse paused for half a second. Kessler's hand stopped moving. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked toward her. "Damage control." He repeated. "Yes, sir." The word stayed measured. "Now." Kessler returned to the wound. "We finished the repair." Claire's eyes shifted briefly to the monitor. 36. The patient's heart rate climbed sharply. "Doctor," the anesthesiologist said, more urgently now, "he won't survive a full repair at this pressure." Kessler's jaw tightened. "We control the bleeding first." Claire took one small step closer to the table. Her voice didn't change. "Temporary packing. Clamp stabilization. Close the cavity. Stabilize pressure before reconstruction." The room grew quiet again. That sequence did not belong to standard civilian surgical rhythm. The resident nearest the table frowned. "That's not our protocol." Claire nodded once. "No." Kessler finally turned fully toward her. "You're an ER nurse." "Yes, doctor." "Then you observe." The words cut clean through the room. "You do not dictate surgical strategy." Claire lowered her eyes slightly. "Yes, doctor." She stepped back again. Exactly one step. The humiliation landed openly now. The residents avoided looking at her. The circulating nurse stared down at the floor. Even the scrub nurse said nothing. Kessler turned back to the table. "Clamp extension," he said. The instrument was passed. He moved deeper into the cavity again, still attempting to repair the injury instead of stabilizing it. The monitor chirped again. 32. The anesthesiologist spoke faster now. "We're losing perfusion." Kessler's voice hardened. "More blood." The bag hung empty before the line finished filling. Claire watched the wound. Watched the blood rise again. The pattern had shifted. The deeper pressure was forcing another vessel open. She saw it before the suction cleared the field. A darker pulse behind the structure they had just clamped. Exactly where the geometry of the wound predicted. The same angle. The same path. Claire stayed silent. She had already paid the cost of speaking. And she needed to remain in the room. Close enough to help when the moment came. The suction cleared again. And the second vessel appeared. A sharp line of pulsing blood exactly where Claire had traced the injury earlier. The scrub nurse inhaled quietly. The anesthesiologist looked up from the monitor. Even the resident assisting Kessler froze. Because the bleed had revealed itself in the exact place Claire had warned about. Kessler saw it too. The room held its breath. The surgeon's hands moved quickly now, shifting toward the deeper vessel. The instrument reached for the new source. The truth had surfaced under the lights. Not through argument. Not through authority. Through blood and anatomy. Claire stood still at the back of the room. Silent again. Because the room no longer needed her words. The evidence was already on the table. The second vessel pulsed clearly now. A sharp, dark surge of blood appeared every time the heart pushed against the remaining circulation. For a moment, no one moved. The suction cleared the cavity again. The source was undeniable. "Clamp," Kessler said. The scrub nurse placed the instrument in his hand instantly. This time there was no hesitation. The clamp closed around the deeper vessel. Blood slowed. Not stopped, but slowed enough that the suction no longer screamed across the field. "Pressure 41, the anesthesiologist said. His voice carried something new. Hope. Fragile, but present. The room breathed again. Kessler worked quickly now, securing the clamp and clearing the surrounding tissue. He did not look toward Claire. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew where the warning had come from. The anesthesiologist glanced up briefly. "Bleed pattern matches the posterior branch," he said carefully. The phrasing mattered. He didn't say Claire was right. He didn't say Kessler was wrong. He simply placed the fact into the room. The scrub nurse followed the tone. "Doctor, second clamp ready if you want control on the medial side." Kessler nodded. "Yes." The hierarchy still stood, but the language had shifted. Measured. Neutral. Evidence-driven. Claire stayed where she was at the back of the room. Hands folded lightly against the metal tray. She did not speak. She did not watch the people. Only the patient. The monitors flickered steadily now. Pressure rising slightly. 44. 47. Still dangerous. But climbing. Kessler worked with renewed speed, controlling the deeper vessel and clearing the remaining blood. For a few seconds it looked like the crisis might finally stabilize. Then the monitor alarm changed tone. The anesthesiologist leaned forward again. Heart rate rising. The waveform began to distort. Blood pressure stalled. 48. Not improving further. Claire's eyes moved from the surgical field to the monitor. Something else was wrong. The bleeding had slowed, but the body was still failing to recover. She studied the ventilator rhythm. Breath in. Breath out. The right side of the chest moved slightly less than the left. Subtle, but wrong. Her gaze shifted to the surgical cavity again. The deeper clamps were holding, but pressure was building elsewhere. A second problem, hidden behind the first. She had seen the sequence before. The kind of cascade that happened when blood loss and pressure changes forced another structure to fail. Not the same vessel. A different system entirely. Claire spoke again. Quiet. Sir. Kessler didn't turn. What? The diaphragm. The room stilled again. The resident assisting him frowned. What about it? Claire's voice remained steady. Pressure behind the clamp. Look deeper. Kessler paused. Just for a moment. Then he shifted the retractor slightly and leaned further into the cavity. The suction cleared the field again. For a second nothing appeared. Then a thin, dark seep emerged beneath the diaphragm. Not a full rupture. A small tear. But enough to release blood into the chest cavity instead of the abdomen. The anesthesiologist spoke immediately. That explains the pressure stall. The scrub nurse reached for another clamp before Kessler asked. He accepted it without comment. The second complication had been invisible moments earlier. Now it sat clearly in the surgical light. Claire watched the movement of the surgeon's hands. Watched the angle of the repair. The tear was small. But if closed incorrectly, it would collapse the fragile pressure they had just regained. The room felt the weight of the moment. One wrong move and everything they had fought to stabilize would unravel. Claire spoke again, softer than before. Pack before suturing. Kessler's hands paused. The resident looked up. Why pack first? He asked. Claire didn't look at him. Pressure support. 3 words. Nothing more. The anesthesiologist nodded slowly. That would stabilize the chest cavity. The scrub nurse had already reached for the packing gauze. Kessler hesitated for one brief second. Then he took the gauze and followed the instruction. The cavity was packed carefully. The pressure stabilized immediately. The monitor responded first. Blood pressure climbed. 52. 56. The anesthesiologist exhaled quietly. That worked. The repair continued. The diaphragm tear closed cleanly. The clamps held. The bleeding slowed to controlled seepage. For the first time since the patient entered the operating room, the numbers stopped falling. Claire stayed silent. No victory. No acknowledgement. She simply watched the monitors. Because the room had already turned. Not through confrontation. Through evidence. Through survival. And through a series of quiet instructions that had kept the patient alive long enough for the surgeon to finish the work. The diaphragm repair held. For a moment the operating room felt quieter. Not silent. Just less desperate. The suction no longer roared. The surgical field remained visible. Blood seeped slowly instead of flooding the cavity. Pressure 62, the anesthesiologist said. It was still fragile. But it was the first number above 60 they had seen in nearly 15 minutes. Kessler worked carefully along the repaired structures, reinforcing the clamps and inspecting the deeper cavity again. His movements had changed. Less aggressive now. More deliberate. He cleared a final pocket of pooled blood and paused. For the first time since the surgery began, he looked up from the table. His eyes moved across the room. Residents. Scrub nurse. Anesthesiologist. And finally Claire. She stood where she had always stood, at the back of the room, hands folded near the instrument tray. Still quiet. Still watching. Kessler held her gaze for a moment. How, he said. The word hung there. Not angry. Not mocking. Just direct. How did you know where the vessel was? The room waited. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the monitor again. The waveform dipped slightly. Pressure slipping. 59. The patient wasn't safe yet. She spoke calmly. We need to control the cavity pressure. Kessler frowned slightly. I am controlling it. Claire shook her head once. Not enough. Her hands moved toward the tray. The tremor that had been visible earlier was gone. Her fingers were steady now. Completely still. The room had reached the point where fear burned away and only clarity remained. She lifted a small set of surgical packs and placed them beside the scrub nurse. Temporary abdominal closure, she said quietly. The resident blinked. We're not done repairing. We don't need to be, Claire replied. The words carried no defiance. Only logic. Pressure stabilization first. The anesthesiologist looked up from the monitor. That could buy circulation time. Kessler studied her again. You're suggesting damage control surgery. Yes. The phrase hung in the sterile air. It was not common language in civilian operating rooms. The resident frowned. That's battlefield protocol. Claire didn't look at him. She looked at the wound. Then at the monitor. Temporary closure. Controlled pressure. Return for reconstruction later. Kessler's jaw tightened slightly. He was silent for 3 seconds, long enough for the room to feel the weight of the decision. Then he nodded once. Proceed. The scrub nurse began handing the materials across the table. Claire moved forward 1 step. Not into the surgeon's space, just close enough to guide the setup. Pack here, she said quietly, pointing to the deeper cavity. The gauze went in. Not tight, she added. Support pressure, not crush. The assistant adjusted. The bleeding slowed further. The anesthesiologist watched the monitor. Pressure 65. Claire continued calmly. Temporary vacuum seal. The circulating nurse prepared the device. The system was applied quickly but carefully. The surgical field stabilized. The body finally began to respond. 71. The monitor beat slower, steadier. The anesthesiologist let out a breath he had been holding. That's the first real recovery we've had. No one celebrated. The room remained focused. But the tension shifted. Survival had become possible. The scrub nurse glanced briefly at Claire. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Recognition. The sequence of steps. The pacing. The language. It belonged to a different world than this hospital. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. That's not standard trauma training. Claire didn't answer. She simply checked the seal on the temporary closure. Across the table, Kessler watched her hands. Steady. Precise. No hesitation. The hands of someone who had done this before. Not once. Many times. The realization moved slowly across his expression. He looked back at the patient, then again at Claire. You've done this before, he said quietly. Claire did not confirm it. She didn't deny it either. She simply adjusted the suction line 1 final time. The monitor reads 74 now. Still fragile, but alive. Kessler stepped back slightly from the table. For the first time all night, the chief surgeon was not the only person in the room whose judgment had kept the patient alive. He understood that now. The rookie ER nurse standing quietly beside the instrument tray had never been the least experienced person in the operating room. She had simply been the one patient enough to let everyone else discover it for themselves. The final clamp settled into place with a quiet metallic click. No one in the operating room reacted. Not because it was insignificant, because everyone was too tired to move. The suction slowed to a soft hum. The surgical light still burned white above the table. The patient's body, pale and wrapped in tubing and lines, remained motionless except for the slow mechanical rhythm of assisted breathing. Pressure 76, the anesthesiologist said quietly. The number was fragile, still unstable, but alive. Dr. Rowan Kessler kept his hands inside the surgical field for several seconds longer than necessary, confirming the temporary closure Claire had helped guide. The wound was sealed for now. Damage controlled. Not fixed. Not safe. Just stabilized long enough for survival to remain possible. He finally stepped back. Transfer to ICU, he said. His voice had lost the sharp edge it carried earlier in the night. No one spoke after that. The team moved with the quiet efficiency that follows exhaustion rather than urgency. Lines were secured. Instruments counted. Dressings checked. The patient was prepared for transport. The entire operating room seemed to exhale at once. Not relief, just the absence of immediate disaster. The doors opened as the ICU transport team entered. The gurney wheels locked beside the table. Careful with the seal, the anesthesiologist warned. They transferred the patient slowly, protecting the temporary closure and monitoring lines with deliberate hands. Claire assisted with the tubing without speaking. Her movements were calm, exact. Once the patient was secured, the transport team rolled toward the hallway. The OR doors swung closed behind them. For the first time in nearly 2 hours, the room was quiet. No alarms. No shouting. Only the dull hum of ventilation and the soft clatter of instruments being cleared. The residents leaned against counters. The scrub nurse removed her gloves slowly. No one celebrated. No one even smiled. They all knew the truth. The patient had survived the surgery. That was not the same as surviving the night. Kessler removed his gloves and dropped them into the waste bin. The sound echoed softly. He washed his hands at the stainless steel sink. Longer than necessary. When he turned back toward the room, most of the staff had already begun to leave. Only a few remained. The anesthesiologist. The scrub nurse. Claire. She was wiping down the instrument tray quietly. Back to routine work. Exactly where she had started the night. Kessler walked toward her. The room noticed. Conversation stopped. No one moved closer. They all sensed something unfinished. He stopped 2 feet away. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he cleared his throat. "That vessel," he said. Claire looked up. His voice was controlled, but uncertain. "You were correct earlier." The admission sat in the air between them. Small. Difficult. Claire nodded once. "Yes, sir." She didn't elaborate. Didn't explain. Didn't remind anyone what had happened. Kessler studied her for another second. Then he gave a short nod and stepped away. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing he could manage. Word moved faster through hospitals than official reports ever could. By the time the patient reached the ICU, a quiet rumor had already begun circulating through the trauma floor. Something unusual had happened in OR 3. The rookie nurse. The correction. The damage control maneuver. No one told the story loudly, but people talked in fragments. Small sentences. Glances. Nods. Inside the surgical observation corridor, a senior hospital administrator stood watching through the glass panel. Dr. Eleanor Vaughan, Chief of Trauma Operations. She had arrived halfway through the procedure after hearing the commotion. Now she watched the final cleanup. Her gaze settled briefly on Claire. The quiet nurse placing instruments into sterilization trays. Vaughan turned toward the anesthesiologist standing nearby. "What changed the case?" she asked quietly. The anesthesiologist hesitated. Then he spoke carefully. "Observation," he said. "And restraint." Vaughan's eyes returned to Claire. She said nothing more. But she did not look away. Recognition in hospitals rarely arrived with applause. It arrived through eye contact, through silence, through the way people adjusted their posture when someone entered a room. As Claire finished clearing the instrument table, she became aware of it. The scrub nurse watching her differently. The anesthesiologist giving a slight nod. Even the resident who had mocked her earlier avoided meeting her eyes. No one praised her. No one congratulated her. But the atmosphere had shifted. Authority had moved. Quietly. Without announcement. Claire ignored it. She finished her work, removed her gloves, and stepped out of the operating room. The hallway outside the OR was empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The adrenaline that had held her steady for the past 2 hours began to drain from her body. She walked toward the supply alcove and leaned briefly against the cool metal cabinet. Her hands finally started shaking. Not the small tremor people had seen earlier. This was different. Deeper. The delayed impact of pressure finally releasing. She closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed gradually. In the operating room, she had been calm because someone needed to be. Out here, no one was watching. The steadiness she had worn like armor all night finally slipped. For several seconds she stood there alone, just breathing. When Claire opened her eyes again, the hallway remained empty. No witnesses. No recognition. No spotlight. Exactly the way she preferred it. She pushed herself gently away from the cabinet, straightened her badge, and walked back toward the trauma floor. The hospital still had patients. Monitors still beeped. People still needed care. And the quiet nurse who had just helped save a life would return to work exactly the way she had begun the night. Invisible. Steady. And silent. The sky outside the tall ER windows had turned a pale winter grey. Rain that had tapped against the glass all night slowed to a thin mist. The city beyond the parking lot began to wake, headlights appearing in slow lines along the street, commuters moving through the early morning dark. Inside St. Gabriel Trauma Institute, the fluorescent lights had never changed. The night shift was finishing its last stretch. Charts were updated. Medication trays restocked. Monitors adjusted for the incoming day team. The energy in the trauma bay had shifted from crisis to exhaustion. Claire Mercer stood beside the medication cart, reviewing the final entries in a patient's chart. Her handwriting was small and careful. No flourish. No wasted words. Around her, the night nurses spoke quietly with the morning staff during handoff. Vitals. Lab results. Pending scans. The ordinary language of a hospital returning to routine. Nothing about the night felt extraordinary anymore. Only heavy. And tired. Claire signed the chart and placed it back into the rack. Just another task finished. Conversations moved through the room in pieces. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just fragments drifting between people who had been awake too long. That case in OR 3. I heard the patient almost coded twice. Someone said Kessler changed the surgical plan halfway through. Another nurse leaned closer, and the rookie spoke up. A resident shook his head. That part's exaggerated. But no one argued strongly. The truth existed somewhere between the whispers. No one had the full picture. Only small observations. A quiet correction. A sudden shift in the room. The patient leaving the operating room alive when no one had expected it. Across the trauma bay, Claire moved past them carrying a tray of saline bags. No one stopped her. But several people watched her for a moment longer than they would have the day before. Not admiration. Recognition. Then the moment passed. Work continued. Room 12 needed a new full line. Room 7 required a medication adjustment. A trauma patient from earlier in the night needed fresh dressings and a temperature check. Claire moved through the routine without hesitation. Her movements were quiet. Exact. Unhurried. She replaced a malfunctioning foot pump before the morning nurse even noticed the alarm. She corrected a mislabeled medication vial and returned it to the pharmacy tray without comment. The same small problems she had fixed at the beginning of the shift. Nothing about her posture suggested the events of the night had changed anything. No pride. No fatigue visible on her face. Just calm attention. The work in front of her mattered more than the story behind it. Near the end of the shift, Dr. Rowan Kessler stepped into the trauma bay. He looked older than he had 6 hours earlier. Not physically. Just worn down by the long night. The conversations around the room quieted slightly as he passed. His reputation still carried weight. But something about the way people watched him had changed. He walked toward the medication station where Claire was finishing a chart entry. For a moment he said nothing. She looked up. "Doctor." Kessler nodded. "Mercer." The old sharpness in his tone was gone. He glanced briefly at the chart in her hands. "The patient from last night is stable in ICU." Claire nodded once. "That's good." He hesitated, searching for words. Then he settled for something simpler. "You handled yourself well in there." The statement carried none of his usual sarcasm. Just fact. Claire returned to her chart. "Thank you, sir." There was no tension between them now. Only quiet acknowledgement. Kessler gave a short nod and walked away. No speech. No correction. Just a different kind of silence. When the charge nurse approached her 10 minutes later, Claire was restocking the airway cart. "You know administration will want a report," the nurse said carefully. Claire tightened the latch on a supply drawer. "They'll get one." "They might ask for more than that." Claire looked up. Her expression remained calm. "I was assisting." The nurse studied her for a moment. "You could ask for recognition." Claire shook her head slightly. "The patient survived. That's enough." The charge nurse watched her close the cart and roll it back against the wall. Some people chased credit. Claire Mercer moved away from it instinctively. Near the end of the shift, as the morning staff finished taking over the trauma bays, a quiet voice spoke behind her. "Mercer." Claire turned. Dr. Eleanor Vaughan stood near the supply station. The chief of trauma operations had changed into a dark coat, ready to leave for the day. She held a small folder in her hand. For a moment she simply studied Claire. Then she said quietly, "That maneuver in the OR." Claire said nothing. Vaughan gave a slight nod. "I've seen it before." A pause. "Not in civilian hospitals." Claire's expression did not change. Vaughan closed the folder. "You adapted it well." That was all she said. No questions. No demands. Just recognition. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. The conversation ended as quietly as it had begun. Room 9 held a middle-aged patient recovering from a minor surgical complication. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. Claire stepped inside. The man looked up as she adjusted the full line beside his bed. "You look tired," he said. Claire smiled faintly. "Long night." She checked his pulse, adjusted the oxygen tubing, recorded the vitals. Everything steady. Everything normal. When she finished, she pulled the blanket slightly higher over his shoulder. "Try to get some rest," she said. The patient nodded and closed his eyes again. Claire turned off the room light and stepped back into the hallway. Behind her, the hospital continued its endless rhythm. Monitors. Footsteps. Quiet voices. The same fluorescent hum that had filled the building all night. Claire Mercer walked down the corridor, another nurse moving through another shift. Calm hands. Steady pace. And within minutes she disappeared into the ordinary motion of the hospital. Exactly where she preferred to be. Unnoticed. Working. Quiet.